2NURFM 103.7. Time to have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. I say that every fortnight when our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, is here. But Jim, today really is kind of the world of politics where it pertains to defence and many parts of the world with the AUKUS agreement. Hello, good morning.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Yes, the AUKUS agreement has global implications, or at least implications for Australia within its own region and its standing in the region. But basically, if we sort of take it a step back, the AUKUS agreement is an understanding formalised between the United States, Australia and the United Kingdom. So there's this three-way agreement about how we're going to interact and work together for mutual benefits and so forth. Curiously, the AUKUS agreement was announced in almost the same breath as the then Australian government under Scott Morrison announced the ending of a contract with France to build nuclear submarines. The AUKUS agreement, and this is an area where a lot of the attention's been focused, the AUKUS agreement was shifting that desire for nuclear-powered submarines or shifting that desire for a new submarine fleet over towards the US, who had convinced Australia, or at least convinced Scott Morrison, that we needed nuclear submarines and that they were best placed to supply them. Putting aside the fact that France could have supplied nuclear-powered submarines had we renegotiated, that's a separate consideration. But within the AUKUS arrangement, the nuclear-powered submarines were going to be the big deal. Huge amount of money, not just on the submarines, but we were looking at $380 billion. Now, unfortunately, those submarines would not come online for a decade plus, maybe 20 years by the time they're actually here, which
That's the problem, isn't it? It's
the gap, Mark.
Yeah.
There's a gap then. What are we going to do between now and then, given that the rationale for having moved in this direction was partly to counter what was perceived to be a threat from China? Having nuclear submarines was supposedly going to be a way in which Australia could protect itself, except how do you protect yourself 20 years down the track when the threat is alleged to be now? So that's one consideration. The implication, Mark, that comes out of all of that is that the US puts up its hand and says, hey, no problem, we can supply you with some lesser nuclear-powered submarines to give you practice at it. We can fill the gap and you can purchase it from us at a reasonable price, all that sort of stuff. And you will fix the strategic hole that you're currently facing. And that all sounds really good until you start to think about what does that really then mean. The issue then, one of the issues around that that's put forward is we get greater interoperability with US defence, which means that Australian defence forces can gain understanding and knowledge from the US defence and so forth. All of that appears on paper to be all to the good. Everything, all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, all the gaps are filled. But there are other issues that arise from that, and that becomes who is actually in control of those submarines. That's one issue. Second issue is the materials that the US places in Australia, that stores in Australia, that locates in Australia. All of these are formally the property of the US. Australia allows rent-free this to happen. That, not an issue there. But the issue becomes when there's perhaps a policy decision or an on-the-ground decision to deploy certain materials in certain ways. To what extent does Australia have a right of veto because it's on its soil? And as far as I can work out, the US still trumps Australia in that regard. Under it's called the 2014 Forced Posture Agreement, which came into effect in 2015, in March 2015, it formalised the arrangements between Australia and the US regarding US materials on Australian soil, the presence of troops and all of that sort of thing. The basic agreement on paper again has built into it that the US must respect Australian sovereignty, that it must not act in ways that are contrary to Australian law and so forth. Yet the unfortunate thing, I guess, Mark, is that the history of US relations with its junior partners doesn't bear any of that out, because as former President Trump said, as President Biden has said in not so many words, as President Obama said, there are only American interests, and America comes first. So when we ally ourselves with a huge, superpower, and their way of being in the world has always been, we come first, our allies fall into line, or suffer whatever consequences might come their way.
Well, see, here's the trick, though, Jim. Everybody has to be on somebody's side. Australia's not big enough to be its own side. We're not a superpower. We don't have enough people. We don't have the enough capability. That's a reality. So we have to be on somebody's side. And if you look at the options around the world, I mean, perceived threats from China, whether they be real, confected, or otherwise, then we're never going to be in a similar agreement with, say, China. That's not going to work. So then you have to look at the options that are around there, and you have to sort of pick, dare I even say it, the best of what may be a bad lot.
Well, yes, I think that's a really important point, and it's one that gets made quite often. But I think one has to step back and understand that you can be allied with somebody without being, shall we say, allied to belligerent postures. You can be seen as a friend of X, of this power or that power, without necessarily being aligned with that power's strategic objectives. Think about New Zealand, for example.
It's tricky, though, doesn't it? Because then you come back to, in this strategic sense, what does being a friend actually mean?
Well, that's another really good question. And Australia's always interpreted that to be where the US goes, we shall follow in various ways. From Robert Menzies' decision as Prime Minister to commit ground troops in South Vietnam in 1965, to John Howard's immediate announcement after the destruction of the Twin Towers that he invoked the ANZUS agreement to say the US has been under attack. I'm invoking ANZUS to say that we will do whatever the US needs us to do in response to that attack. So, and both of those decisions were sort of prime ministerial pronouncements in many ways, because certainly in Menzies' case, this didn't go into the Parliament for discussion. It was sort of an announcement, take it or leave it type thing. And similarly with what John Howard said, there have been other prime ministers in the Labor governments as well, which have taken similar tacks. So the idea here, Mark, is that
everybody
we have to prove ourselves
gone the same way. We
have to prove ourselves to the US, put our hands up and so forth, and be seen to be on the ground with them. That's not necessarily the smartest move in a hostile environment, because you never know which of the smaller powers around you are themselves jockeying for space and what their deal might be with the US. The crunch for us came in over East Timor back in from 75 through to 98, and the US played a sort of double game, supporting Indonesia on the one hand, supporting Australia on the other, and both countries were not entirely disagreeing over the Indonesian position on what was then Portuguese East Timor. But again, the issue there, Mark, is that the US played its own game. It was not necessarily going to back Australia simply because we were part of ANZUS. Think about the Falkland Islands when the British were at war with Argentina. The US was ostensibly neutral, it said. But behind the scenes, it was supporting and assisting the UK in positioning itself so that it would come out victorious. Again, the US was seeking its own outcome, its own preferred outcome, and less concerned about whether Britain got its way or Argentina got its way.
All right, run out of time, Jim. We know that this agreement's going to be around for a while, and we'll see what happens in 20 years when the subs arrive, when we get the price tag.
Well, Mark, it's more than submarines. There's a whole lot
that's true,
which I should have touched on, but maybe another time.
Yeah.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.